Welcome into another episode of the North Carolina Tar Heels Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Logan Lazarchik, as well as lead beat writer for the North Carolina Tar Heels on SI. Back with another episode today, Monday, June 1st, 2026. We are back to provide you more details and news surrounding the North Carolina Tar Heels over this past weekend. But before we get started, just want to thank you guys again for tuning in to another one of these episodes. You can find this podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and all platforms where you get your podcasts. But without further ado, let's talk about the biggest news in Chapel Hill this weekend. The North Carolina Tar Heels officially landing Greek center Alexandros Samodurov, who officially committed to North Carolina on Saturday afternoon. It's obviously a huge deal for Michael Malone and the staff to land the very talented center from Greece. It's another, it was a final piece of this roster that needed to be finalized. And, we've spoke on Samodurov in North Carolina throughout the offseason. It has felt like an inevitable outcome for the last couple of months since the transfer portal opened. And he was another player similar to Matt Abel, who was also testing the NBA waters. He recently withdrew from the NBA draft on Friday. So there was signs that a deal was formulating, finalizing, and materializing. And Samodurov is officially a member of the 2026-27 North Carolina Tar Heels roster. We'll get into what this means for Michael Malone, the roster, rotation, what Samodurov offers on both offense and defense. But I think first and foremost, it is another example of Michael Malone showing the ability to recruit multiple positions, multiple players from multiple areas of the world. Most people, I think, once Malone took this job, the biggest question mark that they had was his ability in the recruiting process. But he hired, multiple coaches that would help that process, multiple people on his staff that would assist him and elevate his ability to land players that he has identified as, top options for his system. And if you look at what North Carolina has accomplished this offseason, it is clear and cut that, Malone wants certain type of players in his roster, in his system. He spoke on that during his introductory press conference of what type of players he was looking for in the recruitment pool, in the transfer portal. And it's pretty safe to say that he, I believe, got every one of the players that he wanted. And I think that's pretty impressive considering that, entering this offseason, North Carolina was a bit in flux with, Hubert Davis being let go after another first-round exit NCAA tournament. 8 of their top 10 scorers from last year's roster departing through the transfer portal or via the NBA draft. And really the roster was Jaren Stevenson, Isaiah Dennis, and Jaden Young for a couple of weeks there when the portal first opened. And North Carolina had a lot of work to do to reconstruct their roster, to revamp a roster that can compete not only in the ACC, but in the NCAA alone. So Malone, I think this is another player that he identified pretty early on in the process of who he wanted to bring in. And Samodurov, if you look at what North Carolina has brought in the front court this offseason, Say and Cade Betterman, both stationary centers, they're not going to really provide a lot of production outside the lane, outside the paint. They're not going to stretch the floor. Samodurov is a complete opposite of those two players, and it's something that North Carolina was desperately in need of, was just another, steady scorer, another player that can create his own basket. And Samodurov, at 6'11", his frame is a bit small, but I do think he'll add some weight. He'll be able to come off the bench, which I think is a major plus for this team. It's not like Malone's going to be asking him to play, 25, 30 minutes a game. He's going to use him situationally. I think Samodurov will play, 17 to 20 minutes a game, maybe a little bit more than that, just depending on, situation or matchups. And as the season goes on, I do think Samodurov's role will, elevate, increase. This is a quietly really deep roster that Malone has orchestrated in, just a couple of months since arriving in Chapel Hill. And I think Samodurov, there's not gonna be a lot of pressure for him to come in right away and light up the scoreboard. And in Greece last summer, in the summer of 2025 with the Greek U20 national team, he averaged 17.6 points, 5.7 rebounds, and 1.4 blocks per game. And so he's not only just a player that can score. He's also a player that can contribute on the defensive end as well, with averaging over one blocks per game. And pairing that with Kada, Jaren Stevenson will be the starting power forward. North Carolina has done, I think, a really good job of surrounding Kada with as many capable ball handlers as they have. You have Matt Abel, Nicholas Abdallas, Terrence Brown, Jaren Stevenson, Maximo Adams, Kevin Thomas, all players that can handle the ball from time to time. And I think when you have a defensive center like Kada, who is dependent on other players creating opportunities for him, I think Michael Malone has done a really good job of surrounding the former Barcelona center with players that are capable of operating in that type of role. So again, I think Michael Malone, I think he's done a tremendous job this offseason, building a roster in less than 2 months that I think will maximize what he wants to do in his system on both ends of the floor. And Samodurov will now focus on the bench perspective of this move. But Samodurov, I believe, will earn the most minutes alongside Maximo Adams and Kevin Thomas. I think those three you will see have the most opportunity off the bench to pair with a few players in the starting lineup. And Samodurov and Kada, I think that's a tantalizing front court tandem that North Carolina will deploy at several instances this upcoming season. And I think that relationship will grow and develop as the season goes on. I think conference play is when Michael Malone wants that to be solidified heading into the NCAA tournament. So Samodurov, I think a weapon on both ends of the floor coming off the bench. I think Maximo Adams will, serve as a really good 1-2 punch off this, in the second unit. And, I think we also talked about, North Carolina and their ability, and, they always had an inside track on Samodurov throughout the offseason based on his connection with Nicholas Abdallas, who transferred from Virginia Tech earlier this offseason. Both players were former teammates in Greece. Samodurov is 21 years old, so he's had a few seasons with experiencing, playing as pro players that have already developed. So I think he'll have a leg up at that, in that point. But, when I watch Samodurov and I watch some of his film, you can definitely see that he is capable of operating, off the bounce. He doesn't have to depend on, post games or anything like that. He can actually generate his own shots, generate looks for others. And, I think when you look at Samodurov, he's one of these prospects. I think he was projected the 72nd prospect in this upcoming draft. And, he's one of the more intriguing players that could have been in this draft. And his ability to hand the ball independently, create opportunities off the dribble. And he can also be a facilitator. And then defensively, he has a high IQ where he can find himself in spots to create turnovers and blocks. And North Carolina is going to be predicated on that on the defensive end, because when you look at this front court rotation, it's still as much as talent as these players possess, there's still question marks, and that's still probably the biggest question heading into this next season is North Carolina's front court rotation with Kada, Bennerman, and Samodurov. None of these players have logged a single minute at the collegiate level. Again, Kada and Samodurov have experience playing overseas against professional players, so that could be viewed as a plus in most people's perspective. But the college game is different. But the good news is they have Michael Malone, who has experience at developing players from overseas, developing chemistry with players, and this season's really going to be predicated on Michael Malone's ability to do that, because there's so many moving parts on this roster. North Carolina's their entire starting rotation outside of Stevenson is brand new, and Stevenson's really the only player from last season's roster that played significant minutes. So there's a lot of moving parts. There's going to be a lot of learning curves. I think North Carolina will experience a lot of speed bumps at the beginning of the year, but that's the time of the season where you want a team to experience those growing pains and figure those things out, rather than when conference play rolls around. So I think North Carolina, you could safely assess that their ceiling in ACC is probably a third place finish. And this roster, I think people will be more worried if the development and chemistry isn't established by the time ACC play rolls around. And so that's why I think the early part of the season, more than any other season in recent memory, is monumental for North Carolina to figure things out, figure out the rotation, minimize the weaknesses they have, maximize the strengths that they have. So early portions of the season, November, December, we'll see North Carolina play against some formidable opponents such as Kentucky at Madison Square Garden. That will be a really big test to see where they kind of sit among the top ranked teams in the country. I do think North Carolina will end up opening the season as a top 25 team in the country. If they're not, they're going to be right on the outskirts of that. But I really think the expectations right now for North Carolina are relatively low, and I do expect them to exceed those expectations. And Samodurov, he is going to be a player that's going to be a key part of this rotation. And I know I've said he's going to play off the bench predominantly behind Jaron Stevenson, but I still think at the same time, especially like when you watched North Carolina last season, there was a lot of ebbs and flows throughout each and every game. Stevenson may not be on his game sometimes. He may be in foul trouble. So the fact that Malone has finally, found that final front court depth piece is a huge deal, because before Samodurov officially withdrew from the draft and committed to North Carolina over the weekend, the front court depth is really, really sparse. It was really just Keita and Betterman, and Betterman's a redshirt freshman from Northwestern. He still has a lot of room to grow in his game. Keita's a very raw player, athletic, can protect the rim, runs the court. Still want to see his offense expand a little bit. And so getting Samodurov, a player like him that can score at will, can score on his own. I'm very excited to see how him and Maximo Adams develop off the bench. And Maximo Adams, I think, is another player from North Carolina that's going to be, crucial for their level of success in 2026. I talked about that earlier. Last couple of weeks, I've written a couple articles about Adams' impact and potential, on this roster with Michael Malone. So I just think overall, when you look at this roster, there's a lot of promising things to kind of evaluate. You can tell that Michael Malone, you can kind of see his image and, his identity in this team and what they've brought in. Like I said, Abdallas, Terrence Brown, Matt Abel, all players. Terrence Brown will predominantly, he won't play along the wing, but Abdallas, Matt Abel, you can see those two players be interchangeable on the wing. One can play point guard, one can play as a small forward. It's really Terrence Brown, I think, will play at the point guard or the shooting guard. But overall, Michael Malone has established a roster with versatility, the ability to deploy several combinations in the rotation. So this isn't going to be like last season where it was really a one-trick pony for North Carolina, where it was Caleb Wilson, Henry Vasar, feed him in the post, hope for double teams to generate, and that kind of opens up your moving the ball and passing lanes. I think this season you'll see a lot of off-ball movement, a lot of screens off the ball, which will create opportunities for Matt Abel and multiple of these players. And Samodurov, like I said, it's probably going to take a little bit of time to see his role develop, see him start excelling in this rotation, in this system, just because, again, he's 6'11". He does have a slight frame. We'll see how that physicality, if he can adjust to that, especially when you look at the likes of Duke and Louisville, who have really generated physical front courts this offseason through the portal and retaining players. So they're going to have their work cut out for them. If you really look at, if there was like a glaring weakness for each team right now, North Carolina's front court is an unknown commodity. We really don't know what we're going to get out of them. And that's probably the biggest, I don't want to say it's like, a glaring weakness or anything like that, like I just said, but maybe a question mark. So North Carolina backcourt production, and I believe Maximo Adams and Kevin Thomas are going to be huge, especially in the early parts of the season, heading into conference play. And they're going to have to let this front court kind of mold together, kind of develop slowly and steadily. I don't think Michael Malone is going to rush this process of bringing in Keita and Samodurov along as the season progresses. I think this is going to be a slow moving. They're going to have to be patient with both players. You're probably going to see, like I said, a lot of growing pains, a lot of things that may be frustrating to watch at the beginning of the season. But I think once those two players gel together, once those two players get acclimated with the roster, with the rotation, with their assignments, I really think you're going to see their games take a leap. And like I said, Keita could be a top pick in the 2027 draft. and Samodurov was, pushing for the 2026 NBA draft. So these are two potential NBA prospects, two potential NBA players in the near future. And so I think Michael Malone, he's taking a shot on these two players' potential, and his, what he's done this offseason, it's not based on what the players are right now, but based on what they could be the next 2 to 3 years. It's really trying to evaluate their ceiling. And so I think, again, Samodurov, one of the biggest additions for North Carolina this offseason, and I think he will quietly be one of the most influential players in the ACC in the 2026-27 college basketball season. But with that will do it for episode today. Again, I appreciate you guys tuning in each and every day during the off season. We'll be here Monday through Friday until the start of the season, football season and basketball season. But we'll see you guys tomorrow and throughout this week with more news and updates in Chapel Hill.